Hello, ladies. Welcome to our monthly Women and Blended Families live stream. This is our September conversation, and we have a great guest lined up to speak with us today. I think you're going to love her topic. But before we get started, as ladies are joining, I would love to hear where you're from. And I would love for you to tag a friend in the comments. Maybe if you have someone who you think could benefit from this conversation, a friend in a blended family, I would love for you to tag them. And our conversation today actually could apply to all women. And you could tag your friends who are looking for some great information about women in blended families, but also in regards to sacred rest. That is our theme for today. I'm going to introduce the guest in a moment. Before I bring her on, though, I want to give some time to find out where people are from, give you some time to get started getting into the chat. I also want to mention that you are welcome to leave a question in the chat and know that we will try to get to those as we can. Any of them specific to our conversation, we would be happy to answer those as we can. And if we don't get to them in the live conversation, we will be sure and answer you later after the live stream is over. So I'm seeing some come on. I see one from Orlando. Welcome. And one from Alexandria, Virginia. That's a pretty place. Love to see that. And I have somebody from Dallas that has come on. Yep, I've got family in Dallas. I go back and forth to Dallas a lot, actually. Oregon. Oh, wow. I bet you may be seeing some change of seasons already. Washington, D.C. Always fun to see people from just across the United States. These conversations are helpful for women no matter where you live. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump in. We want to be sure to capitalize on our time here today. And so I am excited to welcome our guest, Dr. Saundra Dalton-Smith, to our Women in Blended Families conversation. Dr. Saundra is an internal medicine physician. She's a wellness expert, and she is the author of Sacred Rest, Recover Your Life, Renew Your Energy, and Restore Your Sanity. That is the book that we're going to talk about today. She is the author of some other books, but that one specifically talks about the 7 types of rest and how we in our blended families can integrate rest into our lives to produce lasting well-being and happiness. That's what we're going to talk about because we are busy women in blended families, and sometimes we don't get the rest that we need. And Dr. Saundra is going to help us with that. She is an award-winning author. She is a sought-after speaker who combines her medical expertise with a passion for well-being to show us how to master our daily lives. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Saundra.
It is my pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, it's great to have you. So I became acquainted with you many years ago when I read your first book, Set Free to Live Free, Breaking Through the 7 Lies That Women Tell Themselves, another good book that you have written. And I so benefited from that book that I went on to actually quote you from that book in my own book, Step Parenting with Grace. And what you said, and ladies, this is so applicable to blended family life. So she said, perfection is not the goal on earth. Your life is a progressive journey. There will be times of success and times of failure. There will be times of faith and times of doubt. There will be moments of joy and moments of fear. You cannot maneuver this obstacle course we call life and expect to finish the race perfectly. That was just so applicable to me as someone who sometimes could be called a recovering perfectionist, perhaps. But we do sometimes get tangled up in trying to apply perfection to our lives. So,
Absolutely. And I think that's probably how I burned out, trying to
ah,
pursue something that just is not obtainable.
right, right. And then you went on to write the book that we're going to talk about today, Sacred Rest. And, we talk about rest a lot, don't we? But I don't think we always separate rest from sleep. So let's start with that. If you could give us your distinction between sleep and rest.
Yes, well, they are not the same thing, and I think that's part of the problem. Too often we look at rest and sleep as being the same. They're similar. They have things in common with each other, but they have
Mhm.
some very distinct differences. And I think one of the things to keep in mind is that sleep is primarily a cessation activity. When you're doing it, you're not doing anything else.
Right.
Whereas rest is really about restoration. And sometimes the rest you need is not a cessation, but actually an activity that pours back in. I often relate it as as I'm an internist, which means I'm in the ER, the ICU in my medical practice. So
Right.
somebody comes into the ER and they're bleeding, and I tell my nursing staff to suture them up. I've stopped the bleeding, but have I restored them? If
Right.
they lost a lot of blood, they could be severely anemic, and I
Mhm.
send them back out still depleted.
Right.
Well, that's kind of how we approach rest. We stop on the weekends, we take a vacation. So we stop the bleeding, but did we do something that actually poured back into the place of deficit? That's
Mm.
how we differentiate it.
Yeah.
Sleep is a type of rest. It's a type of active or passive, rather, physical rest. But then there's these other areas that we also need to evaluate. Are they the reason that we're tired? Is that where we're fatigued and
Right.
drained?
Right, and you talk about 7 different types of rest, and I love that. I had never seen them broken down like that, and it made sense as I began to read into it and understand them further. But describe the 7 types of rest. Give the name of it, and then maybe just a real brief description so people can understand it.
Yes, so the 7, just to make sure I get them all out there, are physical, mental, spiritual, emotional, social, sensory, and creative.
Okay?
And as I mentioned, physical has 2 components. It has the passive, which is sleeping and napping, and then the active component that we don't always think about, which include anything that improves your circulation, that gets the lymphatic system
Mm,
going. And so it includes things like a leisure walk where you're just getting your blood moving around.
right.
It includes stretching. It includes like using massage therapy or foam rollers or anything like that. Also includes your ergonomics, really, how your office chair and desk fits your body and the
Oh,
effect it
interesting.
has on your body. All of those things play a part in that. And then we have mental rest, which evaluates your ability to clear your mind. So, someone with a mental rest deficit may struggle from concentration problems, or they may find that they lay down at night and they're exhausted, but they can't get their brain to shut up.
Mhm.
And so those are all signs of a mental rest deficit. And so you can experience more mental rest by doing things that actually help you focus and concentrate. This is where meditative type practicing, meditating on the word of God, can kind of push out worry and some of those other rumination type thoughts that we have.
Right.
Spiritual rest really focuses on relationship over religion. So it's looking at what is our relationship with God, and are we spending as much time just in his presence and really being open to having a conversation where he is helping us in our life, not just bringing our request and praying, but are
Mhm.
we actually staying open so that we can receive from that aspect of the relationship? It's about that intimacy component.
Right.
And then emotional rest looks at how well you're able to express your emotions. If you're someone who does a lot of people pleasing, if you have a job maybe where you're in customer service or some type of career where you're having to keep your emotions in check despite people grating on them, some you may find, or if you're a parent with teens, that adds to it too, and you're trying to keep it in check. What ends up happening is we tend to take on some emotional labor. We carry the emotions without an opportunity to release them. And so it's
Mhm.
important to find what are the safe places and opportunity to release those emotions.
Right.
Sensory rest evaluates our sensory inputs. What are the light, sounds, smells, and things that are in your environment? Because even though you may feel as if you're able to tune them out, your body's not tuning them out. Your body's processing it. Your brain's processing that information so you can feel like you're tuning it out. So
Oh,
that can be exhausting. And then the
right.
last two, social rest, deals with the people in your life, looking at whether or not they are pulling from your social energy or if they're life giving, if they're pouring back into you. And then creative looks at beauty, natural beauty like the ocean, the mountains, and the trees, as well as creative beauty like music and art, and the effect that it has on our ability to stay innovative, the drainage of that happens if you're someone who's having to do a lot of problem solving, and creative type things, that's an area of ourselves that can be depleted as well.
Mhm. Yeah, great explanation, and you dive into those even deeper in your book, and it's a great resource for women to be just to dive in and consider which of these could there be a deficit. But there's a couple that I want us just to talk about a little bit further as I think about women in blended families. One of them that really jumped off the page for me was the emotional rest. In your book, you say that women tend to be more vulnerable to absorbing the stress and the negativity of those around them. And so I think specifically for our audience, for women who are in blended families, there can be a lot of stress and there can be some negativity because of perhaps a former spouse that someone is dealing with or a stepchild that they can't form a relationship with, even though they desperately want to. And so I can see how the emotional rest, women can really become depleted of emotional rest. So I just want us to pause a minute and think about what advice would you give to a woman who's really struggling that she can see that in herself to try to help with that deficit of emotional rest?
Yeah, so I think that's the first part of it is really just recognizing it. Being able to see that the fatigue you're experiencing is because you're expending energy in this way.
Right.
And so whether that's expending it because you're empathic and so you're we have what we call HSPs or highly sensitive people. So if you're someone who relates to that and you are open to emotions, then it's very easy to have this area of yourself drained. And so we then have to look at what are the safe places where we can release those emotions, because the
Mm.
more you kind of try to keep them under control, the more you try to keep them concealed, they just become more toxic. And I find that oftentimes when we are afraid that we're going to offend, hurt, or in any other way alienate somebody by sharing our emotions, we will keep them in, which then just leads to that emotional rest deficit.
Right.
So we have to then to think about, how can I share my emotions without trauma dumping? Because that's
Mm.
really what we're afraid of. It's not the emotional rest that then offends, it's the trauma dumping that makes people feel as if, oh, I don't want to hear what you have to share. So I'll give you an example. If something happens and you have an argument with a child, with a stepchild, and you have an argument with this child, and the argument's over, and you go back and you're kind of processing through it yourself, and you're not able to just kind of necessarily say to the child all the things that you're feeling,
Right.
because chances are they've already slammed the door in your face at that point
Right.
if it's hot. So you've walked away, and so now you're trying to process it. You go to your spouse, which is the parent, which is the birth parent of that child.
Exactly.
It does no benefit for you to give a blow by blow account of the conversation. They said this and I said this and this, and basically what you do in that situation is you're trauma dumping. You're trying to bring them into the experience of the pain and the hurt and whatever the heat or whatever that was going on.
Right.
Where emotional rest is actually going to that person and saying, this is how that made me feel. It's way more vulnerable, and most of us fear that. We
Mhm.
fear that level of vulnerability because with the
Mhm.
wrong person, it can leave us more wounded. However, with the
Yes.
right person, it heals.
That is so good because it is about our feelings and be able to express them in a way, though, that we can get acknowledgement of our feelings. I can understand how that was a difficult situation. And sometimes we can even train people in our lives to help them see that I need to express my feelings, but I don't need you to fix them. I need you to listen to them. I need you to just acknowledge that that could be a hard situation for me and just know that this is part of what I am trying to do to make myself healthy. So, yeah, I think that's good. Another one I want to talk about is mental rest. This is one that saw myself in. You talk about how sometimes we've got this ongoing chatter of our mind and we just can't shut it off sometimes. And some of it is because there's so much flux from of information. We are in the information age. We can so quickly become overwhelmed with information from the internet, from other people. It's just so accessible. But then it's also just this internal running commentary that we have with ourselves. And I know for me, and you even talk about this in the book a little bit, is it keeps me from staying in the present. So what happens to me is I often end up getting out there in the future. I think of every scenario that could take place, and so then I end up in fear. And then there's also, I know some people struggle more with getting in the past. So the regrets perhaps from a divorce or another relationship that it hasn't gone well, that stepchild relationship you're still working on, and you contribute everything to your own faults, even though that's not the case often. But we go to the past and then we end up in regret. And then even if we're in the present, sometimes we're discontent in the present, and that's what we focus on. And so I would love for you to talk about this mental rest. If we find ourselves in this cycle and in a deficit of mental rest, what would you say to that person?
I think you have to clear the mental space. You can't always be in a position where you are bouncing all the thoughts around between the present, the past, the future. There has to be time when our brain settles.
Mm,
And so that is the concept of mental rest, creating moments, evaluating what those moments look like for you when you're able to clear out some of the noise that's in your headspace.
right.
And so for some people, if that's really difficult for you, something that we've seen with the research and in real life as we engage with people who are putting all of this into practice, some people experience mental rest best when their body's actually in motion, which then
Oh,
really requires you to dissemble what you've thought rest was, because you think about rest as stopping, not doing anything,
mhm,
sitting around.
right.
However, if you are someone who, let's say you work a job where you sit all day,
Hmm.
but you're exhausted. It's not your body that's exhausted, likely. Chances are it's something else. And for a lot of people, it's the mental aspect of themselves that's exhausted because they've spent all day thinking,
Right.
reasoning, processing. And so those type of people may find that jogging or doing some type of strenuous activity actually makes them feel more rested than just laying around. And the reason being is because if you do something like, let's say, jogging,
Hmm.
during that time, your attention's focused down on some very specific things. You're thinking about your breathing, you're
Right.
thinking about your cadence. You've basically practiced mindfulness without trying to practice mindfulness. You
Okay.
focused your attention, and in doing so, you push out some of those other things that actually try to take up space in your head. And when
Right.
you're focused like that, you can experience mental rest despite your body being completely, being used with the running or jogging or whatever you're doing.
Right.
So many ways of doing that, whether it's crocheting. I know some women do
Oh,
that. Their hands are busy, but in that
yes.
moment, their mind goes blank because they are so focused on, do I loop it here or I loop it there? So they're so focused on what they're doing, they're clear it out. And I think we have to, when we think about mindfulness, particularly as people of faith, sometimes it feels like it's this otherworldly woo woo kind of thing, like mindfulness. But mindfulness is in the Bible when it talks about, think about those things that are true, that are worthy, that are noble. And
Yes.
that's where we have to redirect our focus and our attention. One mindfulness activity that I personally practice quite often, with a child in college, it's really easy to have your mind go all kind of places, particularly
Yes.
at a party school where,
Oh,
where half the kids flunk out. So, it's one of those things where it's like, oh, I can life 360, 360, but
mhm.
I don't necessarily want to know where he's at every second of every moment of every
Right.
day.
I agree with you on that. Yes. Uh-huh.
So I tend to practice mindfulness by concentrating on a specific characteristic of God. So when my mind and the enemy and all the stuff in life tries to get me worried about what's happening on this football Saturday with my sophomore in college, I pick one characteristic of God that I'm going to focus on. And so when my brain tries to go down the rabbit hole of all the things that could, would, should happen,
Mhm.
I redirect my thoughts back to whatever that one word characteristic that I've chosen. And for myself, the word oftentimes is faithfulness.
Oh,
The same
yes.
God that was faithful when he was in my house and under my control is still faithful now that he has a car and his own credit card. You know, I have
Right.
to trust that he is still faithful.
Mhm.
And by redirecting your thoughts, you prevent them from going down these loop cycles. Because once you start worrying, it's hard to break a loop.
It is.
You have to insert something different than what you have been focusing on.
Mhm, mhm. Right, and I think you even talk about that if we can't redirect our thoughts and we continue down this road and the deficit continues, that it is likely gonna lead to depression. I would also think that there's gonna be some anxiety that is gonna
Mhm.
show up when we just, continue down that cycle, and so I think one of the things you were saying is it has to be intentional. We have to recognize that, "Okay, here's where I'm at. Now what am I gonna do about it?" And do something. You were quoting Philippians 4:8. That's a great verse to go to and meditate on. Am I thinking about something that is lovely, or am I thinking about the absolute worst case scenario that could happen here in the relationship with my husband because we just had a fight, or whatever, whatever path we have gone down for the moment, we can pull ourselves back and we can redirect. And I think that's a lot of what you're saying as we consider those different kinds of rest. But I'm curious, I know how you would say that somebody can determine what type of rest they might be missing. What would you say to that?
Yes, this was huge. And it was the question that everybody seemed to be asking after I started discussing this. So we actually came up with a free assessment. It's simply at restquiz.com.
Yes.
And what it does is it gives you a score for each of the seven types of rest. And you're then able to focus your attention on the areas where you have the greatest deficit. I I don't want anyone to feel like, oh, I have to do these seven things because it's you're likely already doing some of them
Yeah.
naturally. That's
Right.
why you're able to actually keep functioning. But there's usually one or two of the rest areas that you either didn't know about or you're not very intentional about
Mhm.
getting rest and restorative practices in that area. And because of that, you're feeling more depleted than you should because these areas have gotten to an empty state.
Right. Yeah. So I love that. You'll notice on the screen, ladies, we have put up a QR code where you can go easily and access this rest quiz that she is talking about. I've taken the quiz. It's very simple. It's not going to take a lot of your time. And then it does help you identify. And I felt like even as I was going through the quiz and answering the questions, I'm thinking, okay, yeah, this is probably what's going to show up at the end of this because I can see how I'm answering some of these questions and what it probably is going to mean. But the other thing I'm curious about is, do you find that our deficits change in different seasons or different situations, or sometimes we need to go back and revisit? Maybe we felt like we were doing really well with our spiritual rest or our physical rest, but perhaps there's a certain situation and wouldn't hurt for us to go back and revisit that. Would you say that's a pretty common, normal thing that happens?
Absolutely. Your rest deficits are not static.
Okay.
That's one thing I should start with. The quiz gives you a snapshot of where you are right now. However, if a death happens, if your job changes,
Mhm.
if you go from summer when you have the kids at home to when the kids are back in school, you will notice a shift in your rest deficits. We
Right.
saw huge shifts just with 2020 just because everybody was home and you
Uh,
had to deal with
yes.
family you didn't have to normally see 8 hours a day. Now you're seeing them 24 hours a day.
Right, and you have no
So
choice about it. Uh-huh.
right. So
Mhm.
so yes, the rest deficits change. So I always have people realize that it's really just giving you some parameters around which to begin your rest journey.
Right.
Because if you're already tired, it is helpful to be able to see in this season, in this current situation, with these things that are happening in my life, this is the area that's causing and adding to the fatigue, the exhaustion, the overwhelm that I'm experiencing.
Right. Right. And then for those of us in blended families, I think sometimes it can be affirming for us to see, okay, yes, it's showing I have some deficits in, say, for instance, emotional rest. And this is why, because of the ongoing flux of emotions in my home that I'm dealing with. And maybe I'm not dealing with them in a healthy way. And then we can learn about it more and try to identify, but there are things I can do about it. I think that's where the hope is found, is not just in identifying it, but what we can do about it. And I know that there's even more in your book that talks about that, Dr. Saundra. But I'm also curious, what are the long-term effects? I briefly mentioned one, but of omitting regular periods of rest, or just choosing to say, but busyness is okay. That's how I've always lived my life. We hear that a lot, don't we? Almost like it's a badge of honor that people wear if they don't have time to stop. But what would you say are the long term effects of that?
Well, there's a couple. As a physician, I think it would uh, I have to start with some of the health related long term effects that include things
Yes.
like insomnia,
Yes.
high blood pressure, any of the chronic stress related disorders from diabetes to metabolic syndrome to strokes. All of these things increase our cortisol levels, increase our inflammatory response, increases how we're able to actually process information. And so those are some of the initial long term effects. And then you take into account things like burnout.
Hmm.
The World Health Organization actually has burnout now as a diagnosis that we can list
Wow.
people as having. So that's another one. And then I think the thing that for me is what drives me to do what I do and the work that I currently do now within companies and organizations is that it actually keeps people from actually living in the fullness of what they're capable of doing.
Oh, right.
One of the characteristics of burnout is that people not only are they tired or that they're not happy and content with the work that they do, but the work that they do is of lesser quality of what they're capable of. And that's sad to me,
Uh
to
huh.
think that there are people who they have the passion and the energy and they may even have the drive to
Right.
do more, to follow God and to things that he's showing them, to do things with your family, and you withdraw from it because you don't have the energy to do it.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and so I want to pause real quick here and tell the listeners that if you have a question specifically about what we've been talking about from sacred rest, put it in the comments. We've got a great resource with Dr. Saundra here right now, and we can ask her your question. So if there's something in specific that we've talked about that you want us to address, put it in there. As you move on into the book, you talk about the gifts of rest. And I really enjoyed reading through these. There were several that I could just resonated with right off the bat. Boundaries is one, because without boundaries, we really can't experience rest in the way that we need to. But several of these gifts of rest that you talk about. So how would you elaborate, or what would you have to say about the gifts of rest?
Yeah. So, well, in the book Sacred Rest, I talk about 12 gifts of rest. So, definitely can't cover all of those. But some of my favorite ones include, as you mentioned, the gift of boundaries, the gift of reflection, the
Yes.
gift of freedom, the gift of choice, the gift of communication. I would probably say, as a parent of teens, my oldest is 19, so he's still technically a teenager. But
Yes.
so, as a parent of teens, what I find is specifically with the gift of communication is the more rested I am, the better I'm able to communicate to a younger generation,
Oh, yeah.
because it's really easy to just get mad when they say something
Right.
because it's just, let's just be straight about it, right? So it's just really easy just to get mad sometimes, particularly just everybody's home this summer, right? And there's certain things that every parent expects kids to do when they're home for the summer, right? Or
Right.
when they're home, period.
Sure.
And so you give your rules, and when rules aren't followed, it's easy to just want to kind of lay the law down and say, "Hey, you didn't do this, that, or the other." But
Mhm.
I'm finding if I'm in a place of where I'm more rested, I'm more willing to be instructive than just be demanding. to follow the
Yes.
rules. And
Uh-huh.
I find that when I'm able to take a step back and be more instructive and actually listen and ask some of the questions to get to what's the root issue? Why aren't you doing what I'm asking you to do?
Right.
What exactly is it? We actually gain more ground in the direction we're trying to go as a family
Mhm.
rather than just, hey, my house, my rules, get it done kind of attitude, which is what's going to come out if
Uh-huh.
I'm not rested.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I mean, that may seem like the easy thing to do in the moment, but the long-term effects of that are not going to be what we want. And so I
Mhm.
think that that is a great illustration of how if we are doing these things and do feel rested, then really what you're saying is our relationships are going to be in a better place. We're going to simply be able to respond to others in a way that is much more productive. Yeah.
Yeah, so true. And then you mentioned boundaries. And I think with boundaries, we really have to be aware of first if we have any. I think
Yes.
sometimes we don't actually have any boundaries.
Yeah.
And so we feel like people are taking advantage of us or, stepping all over us or not or
Mhm.
disrespecting us.
Right.
And it's the thing is, they don't know where the boundaries lie. And so
Mhm.
it's not that they're trying to be disrespectful. They didn't come up against your boundary to see this is too far.
Right.
And so I think we have to really get comfortable with the discomfort of boundaries.
Mhm.
By definition, a boundary is confrontational. It's
Mm,
not a boundary unless it is confrontational. And
mm,
so we have to be okay with
yeah,
a little bit of confrontation and understand that it actually does help protect,
mhm,
not keep out, but actually protect so that they don't get to a place where they have crossed the boundaries and you
mhm.
don't get to a place where you feel as if you are not valued.
Yeah, and just because someone doesn't like our boundary doesn't mean that that boundary is wrong or we shouldn't put that boundary in place. It likely means that is exactly where we need to start because that is a boundary that we need to protect ourselves. So we've had a question come in. I want to ask you
Mhm.
this. One of our listeners says, "How do we bring down our minds when a conflict has just happened or chaos is around us? How do we get to a place of rest after a situation like that?"
Yeah. So in those situations, what I find is your body is going to respond to stressors, regardless of if it's a physical attack, an
Mhm.
emotional attack, a verbal attack, whatever the thing is that seem to come at you, your body's going to respond with the same fight, flight, fawn, or freeze response.
Right.
It's going to pick
Yes.
one of those, one
Mhm.
way or the other.
Right.
And so, when you've activated your cortisol response, you then have to do something to calm it back down. And for most of us, those calming things are things that have to do with sensory rest. There's things that have to do with sensory deprivation. Uh, Agitation, irritation, rage, and anger are the side effect often of sensory rest overload. When your body has been overwhelmed by continuous sensory input, it's easy to kind of slip over into some of those emotions. And
Right.
so you do the reverse, moments in silence. Taking
Mm.
and when I say silence, it may not be something you can quickly find. Maybe it's something you have to actually create yourself. Put on some noise cancellation earphones for 10 minutes just so you can get the silence if it's not in your
Right.
house.
Right.
Take a moment just to lay in the dark with those earphones on. Shut down the sensory input for a moment so that your cortisol response can actually get the message. We are no longer in the danger zone. We've
Mm.
stepped back, we've retreated for a
Right.
moment and can regroup so that you can let all of those hormones kind of come back down, ease back down to a better place before you then go out and do whatever that is. And if you can't turn the lights off and lay down, simply close your eyes for a moment.
Yeah.
In grade school, they used to have us do that, and that was kind of like, if you're not going to sleep, at least close your eyes.
Right.
And a big part of that is sensory deprivation. When you close your eyes, automatically your body just feels this letdown. It
Mhm.
wants to relax. And
Right.
so, just some simple strategies just to be able to trick your cortisol and your stress response system into a place of, okay, we can take a step back. We are in control of the situation. I think that's the thing. Fight or flight is a sense that I'm not in control. I've got to run, fight, freeze, or play dad, fawn. I
Mhm.
got to do one of those four things. When you get this feeling of control back, a lot of that releases.
And in the same similar situation, if we were with a child who we feel like the emotions are heightened and they are out of control, and we believe it's probably a sensory situation, then it sounds like you would suggest we do the same for them. We try to help them quiet their mind. I mean, what are some intentional actions that we can take to help when kids get into those situations?
Yeah, one of the examples I use a lot for it to show what sensory rest deficits look like is, I think every one of us has been in a situation where we had a 2-year-old who's at a party or at something like that, and they're fine the first hour, hour and a half of the party. And then out of the blue, they're screaming their head off, they're banging their fists and their feet on the ground, and they're just having a full on temper tantrum. Well, nothing changed. Nobody took their cake or told them they had to share a toy. They just have become sensory overwhelmed with all that's going on. And what
Right.
do? We say nap time and we go take them and we lay them down and their
Yes.
body shuts down and then they wake up and they're fine again.
Yeah.
When you have a 16-year-old and they're sitting there and they're playing whatever the game of the year is, and let's be honest, they don't play it for an hour. They play it for like 12 hours.
They
And then
will if we let them, won't they?
yeah, and then they come out of the room yelling at everybody, slamming the door. They're just sensor overloaded. They're just 6 foot tall 2-year-olds. At
Right.
that point, it's the same process, same as us adults. You sitting at a desk where you hearing the ting 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 of the phone ringing in the office next to you, or you hear the dinging of the
Mm,
elevator, and you get
right.
in your car and you go home, and it's like kids ask what's for dinner and you bite somebody's head off. You're sensory overwhelmed because it's not the dinner. They're hungry.
Right.
They're not being offensive. They want food. And
Exactly.
so, it's one of those things where we then just have to see, how can we help this, whoever the person is,
Mhm.
quiet it down. It
Mhm.
could be as simple as, if your child seems to get out of school and has that irritation, agitation, rage, or anger symptoms you're noticing, don't drive home with music, drive home in silence.
Oh,
Turn the radio
wow.
off.
Okay.
Try to create a moment of sensory reprieve, even though, you're not sitting in the darkness, you haven't told them to take a nap. That's probably not going to go over with an 8-year-old. They might not take naps anymore. How
Right.
can you create moments of sensory reprieve? TV's playing in the background
Yeah.
just because the TV's playing in the
I
background.
was just
Turn the
thinking
TV
about
off.
that. Yeah. Mhm.
At night, when everybody's trying to rev their body down from all the cortisol response, start turning off some of the lights. Have
Yeah.
lights that actually have a lesser wattage that you use at nighttime, so that you create kind of, when you first get married, you call it creating ambiance. Well, create ambiance in your home with your kids where you turn all of that down a little bit, have it be a little bit of a darkening effect that starts happening long before anybody gets in the bed,
Mhm.
because you need some of that emotion and some of that cortisol release to start winding down long before your body hits the bed. If
Yeah.
you wait till when you flick the light off right before you go to sleep, and that's supposed to get you ready for sleep, you're probably going to toss and turn for about 30 minutes before your body finally settles down.
Yeah, if it does settle down, because sometimes if you end up tossing and turning in bed, then it just makes it that much harder. And I think for our kids too, then sometimes we have to put some of those boundaries in place for them with their electronics. And,
Mhm.
we have to be the parents and put some limits on things to help them when we know that that's the situation. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Mhm. Well, thank you, Dr. Saundra. Your research and insights on rest are so helpful, and we will put back up our QR codes that give information about your book and the rest quiz. All of that is so helpful, and we want for our audience to be sure that they can capitalize on that. So, thank you for joining, and we so appreciate the work that you do.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Great. And to our listeners, be sure and check out the rest quiz that I just talked about, and also her book, Sacred Rest. And then next month, I want to let you know we're excited to welcome Michelle Niedert. Michelle is a licensed professional counselor and author of several books, but her most recent ones are God, I Feel Sad, God, I Feel Scared, and Managing Your Emojis, which is really all about managing our feelings. And so we're going to talk about that, how we do that in our blended families. I hope you'll make plans to join us October the 10th at 3 o'clock Central. You can join it live, or later for the recorded. And then also, our upcoming Step Family Summit is coming up. This is our annual event that we do to train ministry leaders and pastors and counselors who are doing ministry work with blended families. And this year, it is completely virtual. So if you know someone, if your pastor perhaps is interested in learning more about how to minister to blended families, let me just encourage you to get them information about the summit on Step Family Ministry. It's October the 12th. We do have information on that also that you will see on the screen. And this year, our topic is all about how to merge Step Family Ministry into your church. There'll be some wonderful speakers there. Ron Deal, of course, will be one. I'm emceeing it, and we have other pastors who are coming in that will give us just great information and great speakers. So God bless you, ladies. Thank you for joining us. Psalm 18:25 tells us, to those who are faithful, God shows himself faithful. So keep pressing on, and we'll see you next time.